Mr. Chairman, Your Excellency, the Governor General's Deputy, members of Cabinet and Parliament, Father Mike, distinguished former Attorney General, Panel Campbell QC, members of the Diplomatic Corps. I see some aspiring candidates for the next general elections here. Jomo, sorry, Mr. Speaker. Members from the Red Cross with Bernard and all invited guests. Now, I want Vibrating Cakes was paying tribute to Her Excellency, Mrs. Dawn Smith. You know, she is from Connery. And the Governor General is also from Connery. And you know where the Prime Minister is from, you heard it from, so it seems as though Connery rule things. Not bad for a small village of a few hundred people, eh? Yes. I want to thank Skakes. And also the New Kingston Chorale. I don't know if persons appreciate that there are several unofficial anthems. We heard 3 this evening, the one from 1969 by Pat Prescott, which is a beautiful song. We have the one from Beckett, and then of course Skakes' song, and I'm sure that there are 1 or 2 others, but we are rich in this regard.
2 from Beckett.
You have 2 from Beckett. Dougie corrects me, there are 2 from Beckett. You can also put Razamon, and we will go on and on, because that's the point I'm making. There's so many. I want to thank the University of the West Indies Open Campus for this invitation. And Eloise would be able to confirm, and Angie, who is here. I spent a lot of time on it. It's about, well, it's 89 pages. I know, but I wrote it not to read from it in that sense, but I want to publish it so that we can have the benefit of it for the students, and we have to put things on record. Clearly, I wouldn't touch all the issues raised, but I want to highlight at least the following matters in the discussion on the subject: construction, reconstruction, and transformation, the promise of independence in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I want to review what happened between conquest and settlement, 1763 to 1800. And land distribution between 1763 and the present time. The peopling of the nation, the demographics. You know, a lot of times analysts ignore some of these things. But all of us here know that what happened in conquest, between conquest and settlement, helped to shape immensely the future of what we now know as St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The resistance which took place, the consolidation of colonialism. We have to address the land question, because when the British came here, the land was owned in common by the Kalinago and the Garifuna. And indeed, they used their sovereignty and independence to permit the French to occupy some lands on the western side of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, then known as Uramaine. Some say Yulu and the Bagos, and others Hairuna, same place. And then, of course, the peopling of our country. You had about 10,000 Kalinago and Garifuna estimated here when the British arrived in 1763. By 1800, you had no more than 1,500. And then, to satisfy the plantation economy of sugar, about 55,000 slaves were put to work, enslaved Africans, enslaved African bodies, mainly from West Africa. And then Madeira and Portuguese were brought between, well, first of all, liberated Africans, quote unquote liberated as indentured servants, certain number, small number. Then over 2,000 persons of Madeiran descent, Portuguese descent from Madeira. And then between 1861 and 1880, 2,500 Indians approximately. So you notice the indigenous peoples are wiped out. They're Anglo-Saxons constituting the colonial regime, the planter merchant elite, enslaved Africans. Then other Africans, small number, and they came about because they were left at different posts at the time after the slave trade was abolished in 1807 in British ships. But other people were enslaving Africans, and they were located at different places. And some were recruited as indentured servants, and then Portuguese migrants as indentured servants, and Indians. That's the population which we have now. In other words, in the first 100 years, this is what colonialism put in place. So we have to understand these foundations. Then, the society which was imposed was a culturally plural society, and through the fever of history, we arrived at a position of a stratified society with class, ethnicity, status, and gender in the social stratification mix, but with a core of shared values. It's amazing, out of this feverish history, that we were able to evolve in this way. How did this happen? And then critically, this thing called the state, the institution of the state, how it emerged. What is this thing? What role does it play in our lives? It employs, to begin with, currently, 25% of the population, which is working. Still a private sector dominated society, but there's significant employment in the state sector. But what does the state represent? What does it mean? How did it originate, and how it came about, how it evolved, and how we move from colonialism to parliamentary democracy. And then we have to look at the evolution of the political economy, which underpins all of this. Sugar, and arrowroot and cotton, and bananas, up to the middle 1990s, and then our efforts to establish a service-based economy from then and subsequently. What does that mean to all of us? What were the promises of independence? And some conclusions I would suggest, and some challenges for the future. That is how basically I'm going to shape the discussion this evening. Can't talk everything, and some subjects would get more attention than others. And sometimes, like cakes, some occasions I will freestyle, and other times I will read from the text, depending on what I consider to be appropriate in all the circumstances. Now, I want to begin by stating that prior to British colonial conquest and the onset of its settlement in 1763, occasioned by the imperial carve-up of the Eastern Caribbean between Britain and France at the Treaty of Paris, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, as we know it now, that country, was an independent, self-governing nation. It's an important point to begin with. And the people who owned the country, to whom it belonged, didn't invite anybody, didn't give permission to anybody who came after 1763, save and except the permission they had given to the French, some French settlers. So on October 27, 1979, our nation reclaimed its independent status, under and by virtue of the St. Vincent Grenadines Constitutional Order, United Kingdom Statutory Instrument 916 of 1979, issued by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II on the advice of her Privy Council in London, dated July 26, 1979. So by July the 26th, we knew what the date for independence was going to be. This formal order was made consequent upon two transformative events. There's some people who don't think that independence is a transformative event, and I will speak to that. Two transformative events. A negotiated constitutional settlement between the representatives of the British and Vincentian governments, whereby the status of association of St. Vincent with the United Kingdom was by mutual consent to be terminated on October the 27th, 1979. And two, the request for and consent to the making of the constitutional order was effected by way of a resolution of the House of Assembly of the Associated State of St. Vincent and the Grenadines on February the 9th, 1979. In other words, before the eruption of the volcano, the Parliament here had already given their consent by way of a resolution to move to independence on a particular date. Between 1763, if I may say this, the fact that the government of the day unwisely did not permit a sufficient inclusiveness in respect of the negotiations for independence. Doesn't mean that what took place was not transformative. Between 1763 and 1979, British colonialism ruled the political routes in various constitutional guises and at varying levels of local autonomy, save and except for a 4-year period, 1779 to 1783, when its imperial rival France temporarily dislodged its governance. By the way, where there still ripples, lands which were given to Colonel Etherington on the western side of the island, where when the French came and Colonel Etherington had some soldiers with working the land. You think it's only the prison the prisons you have that kind of thing, or police people working land? Happened long ago. And the French came and took possession there. And from there they came down to what is now Kingston and took over the country for 4 years. But I say there are echoes. You see that land with Colonel Etherington? You have about 200 and something acres. We are actively discussing now. The cabinet has taken a decision to carve it up for farmers, traditional workers and farmers, to get into the legal business of medical cannabis. We'll have to do some preparatory work by putting a jetty, because there are problems by road to go across the Richmond River. That is what colonialism gave to Etherington. It will come to the brethren who are going to, and sisters who are going to produce medical cannabis. You notice how we're still solving the problems from there. Why it is important we understand it. So 40 years have now elapsed since our nation reclaimed its independence after 216 years of European suzerainty. This reclamation of independence, amidst all its complexities, contradictions, possibilities, and limitations, is worthy of commemoration and celebration as we ponder and act upon the theme which has been given to us for our reflections here tonight, which itself is enveloped in the nation's clarion call for renewal at 40. I want to speak a little first about the assertion and defense of independence by the Kalinago and Garifuna people. Because what happened in St. Vincent, and that is what it was called before independence, after the British came. So when I use St. Vincent, the Grenadines, one is after independence, the reclamation of independence, and one is before. Just so that you would understand the story before I give some of the details. It took the greatest imperial power of the day, Britain, to subdue the Kalinago and the Garifuna. It didn't take them 2 days, 3 days, as what happened in the anti-colonial uprising in 1935. It took them nearly 40 years to do it before they could properly establish control over this country, over the land and the people. Nowhere else, absolutely nowhere else in the Caribbean did indigenous people fight in this manner for their sovereignty and independence and for their lands. Nowhere else. Certainly where there were skirmishes, they were nowhere as prolonged. In fact, where there were activities in Jamaica by the Maroons, the British settled with them in 1738. In fact, offered similar terms to the Kalinago and the Garifuna, and they refused. Now, if you think that that happened so long ago, that it doesn't mean something to our independent spirit and our dignity, people have another guest coming. If the travels of Paul throughout the Roman Empire is still influential today, you think what happened in a shorter period of time, in a limited geographical area, it still doesn't have influence? The difference is because what Paul did is known and celebrated, and it is written down in the New Testament, but ours is still covered, and we have to open it up. It's important for us to grasp this. So, similarly, if I may go ahead of myself, go forward and to come back, the shortest period of the enslavement of African bodies in the Caribbean came here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. 1764 to 1838. A slave economy had already been established in St. Kitts by the 1630s, in Barbados. In fact, Barbados and Virginia were the first two, and they had assemblies. Virginia was 1619, the first set of enslaved Africans, and Barbados shortly after. Antigua, the islands which were ceded, quote unquote, to the British at the Treaty of Paris. Dominica, Grenada, Tobago, and St. Vincent and Grenadines. Tobago was basically a land without people. Dominica had Kalinagos, but a very small population relatively. And they had about 500-600 Frenchmen and women involved in activities, serious activities there. They're located between Martinique and Guadeloupe. Grenada was already touched by colonialism. The French had established the elements of a state there. And that's why, when you had for the Windward Islands, that the capital went to Grenada. But St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and you had slavery in Grenada when it was ceded, organized by the state. But here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, that was not the case, except on the western side of the island, where the French settlers has brought some of their enslaved Africans. So that when the slaves ran away from Barbados, where they had no mountains to hide, and they came here, they know what slavery was like. So they weren't, and they intermarried They had children with the Kalinagos. They weren't allowing anybody to come and fool around with imposing slavery here, because they know what it was like in Barbados. That again is unique in this St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I always tell people that not because a lot of people come and meet us and we talk nice and polite. There was once a judge here and he was behaving in a particular manner on the bench when I was practicing law. I went and talked to him privately. I said, listen, your attitude is wrong with lawyers and people who appear before you. I said, this is a strange place. It's a unique place. I said, one morning you will wake up, and when they pull in the rope, you'd realize that everybody pulling the rope one time on you. But if you don't know it, you have to know it. So don't believe that because we are so similar, we don't have differences. So I want to talk about the assertion and the defense of independence by the Kalinago and Garifuna people. It is innate to human beings who live in organized societies to assert or reaffirm the natural and precious right to sovereignty and independence, their associated fundamental collective rights to their lands, internal waters, seas, resources, and their inalienable right to self-government. Empires never understand that. Whether it's the Roman Empire, whether it was the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, the Spanish Empire, the Portuguese Empire, and now the American Empire. That is something which a lot of people take for granted. That innate sense, they don't like other people try to rule us. Now when it started, when all hell metaphorically broke loose in St. Vincent, is when the British said, they made a declaration in 1764, that all the land in the country belongs to the British Crown. Well, if I own all the land before and you just come where you come from, I didn't ask you to come. You come from far away in Europe. You come and say that my land belongs to you. I'm going to fight you. I'm bound to fight you for the land. It's natural. And you want to rule me on top of that? No. I'm going to fight you. And there's a lot of bush. There are a lot of mountains. You could have a lot of weapons, but we can wage guerrilla war against you. This is what happened. I'm giving you graphically, this is part of the construction of our country. And we know the story, how this official land grab immediately sparked widespread guerrilla resistance, punctuated by peace agreements which the British duly broke until 1795, when Chateaubriand was ambushed and killed, a circumstance which presaged the people's defeat, subjection, and deprivation. And in victory, the British were brutal. It doesn't, the fact that today we are friends of the British doesn't mean that we must hide the fact that they were brutal. It doesn't mean that we live in the past. But we understand that past for it to help us how we must act today, so that we do not desecrate the future, which of all time is the only time we have possibly to desecrate, since the present is the past, and the past our fathers' mischiefs. They corralled over 5,000 and sent them to Baliso. One half of whom died, as we know, over a 6 month period from hunger, lack of food. They were thirsty, they had no water, and lack of amenities. And the other half, they transported them, the British transported them forcibly in exile to the Bay of Honduras and on the island known as Roatan Island. And the remainder, well, after there was still resistance. Chateau's son, for instance, was killed in the Calico area. We must continue to read the history, you know. And Duvalier is an underrated leader, you know. We're talking about Chateau. That's an underrated man. So Vincent Beach always feels that he should be the second national hero of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Now, what did they do? They put them in the bulk of the indigenous people in the inhospitable northeast on just over 200 acres of land. Cut off from the rest of the population, made worse by the gorge with the 1813 eruption of La Soufrière. We have the dry river and confirmed in 1902, well, strengthened further in 1902 eruption. But what the British did, incidentally, you know, by 1800, they took away the right from, they declared that no indigenous person, no Carib as they call them, which is a pejorative term, had any right to own land. 37 years earlier, in 1763, they owned all the land before the British came. Now they can't own a piece. And then you wonder, just think about it. You take away everybody's land. You take away the people's land. You exterminate large numbers of them. And those whom you left back were largely old people and very young people and women. Now, you do that. Who's going to eke out a living in the seawater, catch fish, and work the land? And when the women, because it's natural that for a civilization to continue, you must have offspring. In the animal world, we are not plants. So men from outside will go up, and then all of a sudden, they start to tell us how Caribou men lose. You know that. You're growing up, they tell you that. They still tell you that. You see the origins? You see where it is? Why we have to interrogate this thing properly and come to a proper understanding. When on the other hand, it's those very women who are able to hold their families together. Strong women. Same thing like the African women and the Madeiran women and the Indian women. And while the British were saying that these were loose, they didn't have prostitution, you know. You go to the streets of London, you have it. In those days. And we have to cleanse our mind of so many cobwebs. To clean our minds to see the path going forward. Not to live in it, you know, doggy. to live in it. Not to whitewash it either. Not today. If you're Kalinago or Garifuna, or a descendant of a slave, or the descendant of an indentured servant, to have a sense of victimhood and live in the past, is to take that history, to see what it does to you, and strengthen you, and fortify you, to make the future better. And don't forget where you come from. And that's why I say, we're not better than nobody, and nobody is better than us. You know, I want to read a long quotation from Professor Max Edelson. Published a book in 2017. I didn't know of its existence until I went to Virginia and he gave me a copy. I went to Virginia in June. It's called The New Map of Empire. And this is what he said. Bear with me. Britain, and there are several quotes in this from a number of authoritative sources. Said Britain invaded Carib country to complete the settlement of that very important and valuable island. That's in quotation marks, you know, that's what was considered. This place was valuable. By the end of 1772, 2 army regiments arrived to force the Caribs, the indigenous people, Kalinago and Garifuna, to terms, modeled on the 1938 treaty with the Jamaica's Maroons, designed to make them, quote, useful subjects instead of dangerous enemies. If they declined, instructed Colonial Secretary Hillsborough, troops were authorized to forcibly transport them off the island, perhaps to some unfrequented parts of the coast of Africa. That's where Hillsborough said, there's a street here named Hillsborough. You know. In our 40th anniversary, we need to keep the name Hillsborough. In preparation for the attack, the Army Engineer Harry Gordon and Chief Surveyor John Byers, B-Y-R-E-S, welcome, Your Excellency, reconnoitered the windward coast in search of safe anchorages and landing places. Hostile islanders fired at them when their vessel came into view of the shore. The campaign against the Caribs met with, quote, many obstacles. Those savages are desperate and determined, and the issue of the war against them is become doubtful, unquote, wrote John Pownall, former Secretary of the Board of Trade, and now John Colonial Undersecretary. With their intimate knowledge of the rugged country, the Caribs inflicted casualties on troops and destruction on plantations with impunity, refusing to meet in open engagement with British forces and evading pursuit by escaping to the security of the interior. After the army established fortified posts along the windward coast, its troops completed the long-delayed coastal road from which they laid waste to carry provision crops. When news reached London that British troops had slaughtered a, quote, parcel of innocent savages in cold blood, unquote, parliamentary critics began to question the whole strategy of financing empire by expanding plantation slavery. Many Britons questioned the moral authority of an empire that would use violence to attack, quote, an independent nation, the original and rightful possessors of the island of St. Vincent, unquote. That's what Professor Edelson is saying. You notice who they shot down Father Mike in 1772? This is what they call the first Carib War, you know. It's really the first phase of an ongoing struggle. A parcel of innocent savages in cold blood. And there are people who tell me that there was no genocide. And that there should be no reparations for native genocide. As a consequence of that native genocide, we see a legacy of underdevelopment in quote-unquote Carib country, and in St. Vincent and the Grenadines as a whole. And there are people who tell me I am talking pie in the sky to talk about reparations for native genocide and African slavery, and I'll come to that. Enslavement of African bodies. I'll come to that. Well, it's not an easy road. It's never an easy road. Father Mike, Jericho Road has a lot of bandits, you know. Jericho Road is not an easy road. And as we know, priests, not Father Mike, and Levites will pass by and leave you. And commentators and publicists on this dangerous Jericho Road. Now, Dr. Fraser has written, as you have heard, on this very subject, and he has a lot of good work. And by the way, I'm very happy that Dr. Fraser, Dr. Denny, Michael Denny, Dr. Arnold Thomas, and Dr. Cleve Scott are working together on a comprehensive book which the government is funding, the research, everything, the writing, the publication, so that we'll have a standard text in the school so that we'll be able to teach our history properly. Now, between 1764 and 1800, the British disposed of nearly 40,000 acres of land on the island of St. Vincent. That's a remarkable story, you know. You will say, well, yeah, but St. Vincent got more land. Yes. 133 square miles on St. Vincent equals 85,120 acres. Google it, look it up, and you'll see how many acres to a square mile. If you think I am telling you the truth, write it down. But 1/3 on St. Vincent was covered in forest. Yes, sir? So between 1764 and 1800, these fellows carve up most of the land. And I want, this thing is of special interest to me, land. A lot of people don't study land. Maybe because I come from a community, a farming community, and land is important to us. And I'll tell you, the old people, it's only nowadays people selling their land, you know, their inheritance. The old days, if piece of land come in your family, you don't sell it, you keep it. And in the old days, they used to say land for the boys and money for the girls. Well, land for everybody now, quite rightly. And that's an important issue to be addressed. And the progress we have made in our patriarchal society, where the power is distributed along patriarchal lines. And we'll see the progress that women have made. Enormous progress. But the land. First, there was a grant of 4,000 acres to General Robert Monckton, a British hero of the 7 Years' War, because that is what the Treaty of Paris brought to an end. No, they didn't give him land in London, Oxford, Cambridge, or Manchester. If it's your hero. You know where they gave him the land? 4,000 acres, between what is today Bayabu on the north and Stubbs Village on the south, and extending inland to the headwaters of the rivers flowing from the Mesopotamia Valley. Secondly, a large tract of land is given by Governor Valentine Morris to Lieutenant Colonel George Etherington. The land was north of and bounded on the south by the Walilabu River on the northwest coast. Thirdly, in the early years of settlement, the British government sold 20,538 acres. Then between 1776 and 1779, they sold another 2,156 acres. If you do the work diligently, you could find them. And there was a grant of 6,000 acres of what are called Carib country lands to Colonel Thomas Brown, an American royalist from Georgia, USA, who had fought with the British in the USA's War of Independence. In fact, when some of the British who were here heard that he was getting so much land, they started a war about it. And they only ended up giving him 1,600 and something acres, which is really Grand Sable Estate, all the way up to what is now called Bronxtown. PR is like yesterday it happened, you know, when they tell the story. It's like yesterday it happened, because we see the living things. And you go up Chester Cottage, you find a lot of Bronx. Bronx with an E. Now, after 1800, there were lands which in 1773, 27,628 acres of land, which were in the settlement for that first Carib War for the British. They were taken back and otherwise granted to war veterans and lease and so on. I'm not sure. I've been looking to see what happened to 1,210 acres, which were granted by the British to so-called friendly Caribs after 1772 Carib War. In every struggle, you know, you have fifth columnists. So don't forget, they were friendly Caribs, you know. Quote unquote, at least the British thought so, and they set aside some lands for them. I'm checking to see what happened to those. I can't find out. So, in every struggle, you have to examine the horns of men and women, you know. It's an ancient admonition. Now, by 1777, which is 14 years or so, 14 or so years into British colonial rule, 34,906 acres of land were in the hands of estates, mainly producing sugarcane with enslaved African labor. By 1827, 110 estate holdings accounted for 44,798 acres in the whole of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Out of, for St. Vincent and the Grenadines, 96,000 acres, still 1/3 in forest. 44,798 acres, 1/3 in forest, Sam. But you see how much land they already have? And if you think, you can read the account of this, the 1827 details in Charles Shepherd's book called A Historical Account of the Island of St. Vincent. It was first published in 1831, but thankfully it was republished in London by Cass and Company Limited in 1997. Over 100 years later, 1835, at the time of the anti-colonial uprising, land ownership remained roughly the same as it was in 1827. I look at the list. And that was despite the fact that after the big hurricane in the 1890s, and the British had sent a royal commission out here, and they distribute some land in Three Rivers and Park Hill, and one or two other areas. Adrian has discussed that question too. Then, in 1946, the Colonial Land Settlement Scheme, that came because McIntosh was demanding land settlement, land reform. 4,004 acres of land at 13 locations on the northwest of St. Vincent between Curtains and Richmond Vale were divested from private estate ownership into government hands and small peasant holdings. If you want to read more about that, John has a very good book, not well known. And for a lot of people it's boring, but it's a minefield of information. Because this particular information, remember he was working at Surveys now, so he got the old files. And he has it in his book. It was not until the period between the late 1970s and 1985 that estate land ownership and the plantation economy virtually collapsed due to a combination of popular democratic and trade union activism, the inefficiencies of plantation agriculture, the internal alterations in the mode of production arising from the shift to banana cultivation, from sugarcane and arrowroot to banana cultivation, the changes in the external political economy which made the plantation-focused sugarcane and arrowroot production uncompetitive, and of course land distribution interventions by an increasingly democratized and self-governing Vincentian state apparatus, James Mitchell, Milton Cato, the gave lands. Interestingly, Joshua, who campaigned a lot for lands for the landless, when he was in power, only the lands at Fancy he took. Look elsewhere. Or he took some lands in Connery to build housing estate and one or two other places, but large-scale land reform that was done by Mitchell and Cato. Papi Josh didn't do it. It's an often overlooked point there. And when we're talking about who to put for national heroes, I support Joshua too, you know. And I support Joshua. Now, after the mid-1980s, when Orange Hill group of estates with 3,400 acres was acquired by the state, largely distributed to small farmers and former estate workers. Today, other than lands in the hands of the state, on mainland St. Vincent, you will hardly find any one plot owned by anybody in excess of 50 acres, other than the state. Of course, in the Grenadines, you have Mustique, you have Canawan, you have Petit St. Vincent, you have Petit, you have Palm Island, and also foreign ownership of lands here in St. Vincent for hotels like Buckamar and down at Peter's Hope, for the move-into services. And a significant landowner now is the Cocoa Company, which is largely owned by a British resident in Beckway, but who has a Vincentian citizenship. And he's doing good work with cocoa, but it's a fact that he has a lot of land. Well, the Cocoa Company has a lot of land. And he has leased much more than what he actually owns. And what condition did British colonialism, with its illegal land grab and native genocide, leave the Kalinago and Garifuna people? I want to read a summary handed down by a special magistrate named John Anderson, with his colonial and even racist prejudices. In 1836, 73 years after British colonialism was established, and 41 years after Chateauyeur's death. Just in case, Your Excellency John Anderson lived in the great house at Connery Estate, Upper Yard. You know where the grafted mango tree them used to be, and where we used to go as boys and to hunt manikou. Up there he lived. It's real, you know. Father Mike, it's real. I'll tell you what John Anderson said, and it's very interesting. It's in a book called, edited by Professor Roderick MacDonald, published by UWI Press in 2001, entitled Between Slavery and Freedom, Special Magistrate John Anderson's Journal of St. Vincent During the Apprenticeship Period. Quote, "It is certainly a surprising fact that so insignificant a body as the Caribs amounted to when finally transported to the island of Ratan in the Bay of Honduras, being in all 5,080 men, women, and children in March 1797, should for 2 years have baffled the energies of Great Britain." This is during the First Carib War, so-called. "It speaks little for the military skill of the generals employed, even allowing for the localities of the island favorable to the guerrilla warfare." Of course, he's an Englishman, he's there, speaking little of their military skill. We ain't talking about the military skill of those who resisted. No, taking that for granted. With their extinction as a warlike nation, every energy seems to have expired. The few Caribs who are allowed to exist in the northern quarter, which is designed by their name, are a wretched remnant in body and mind, with an innate abhorrence of labor, looking upon idleness as the summum bonum, that's the highest good of life. Idleness, this fellow is saying, you come and take with the lands, you know. They are still divided into yellow and black Caribs. The latter sprung from the Aborigines and Negro slaves. Being passionately fond of spirits, the planters occasionally succeed in rousing them, the Caribs, from their torpid state by the temptation of rum, when they will assist in shipping off the sugars from estates. In every other respect, they are useless to themselves or others. Now, there are a lot of prejudicial statements here, there's a lot of racism. But what John Anderson, amidst all of what he's saying, that when the British were finished with the Kalinago and the Garifuna, what they call the Caribs, they were a wretched remnant, weak in body and mind. And that is how a once proud and tenacious people had become after they had been subjected to what they have been subjected to. Father Mike, when you're doing the book of Isaiah about people, the Hebrew people who coming out from captivity, there's a parallel here. So that, I don't want you to corrupt Isaiah, but you understand the point I'm making. The people of the region, so I dealt with lands. Now people. Well, I'd indicated the numbers, roughly. 176 enslaved African bodies were forcibly embarked on ships on the west coast, bound for St. Vincent. Of this number, 55,562 disembarked. 6,614, or nearly 11% of those who embarked, perished across the perilous and cruel Middle Passage. And they're telling me there's nothing for the enslavement of Africans. You took them illegally, put them in the ships, and 11% of them, which is, when you read the literature, is about the numbers which would perish. It's a significant number of people. And if you want to read about this, I'm not just telling you this, I want you to go online. Camilo had drawn this to my attention. There's the slave database by Emory University, 2013. You're familiar with the base, Jomo? The slave database for Emory University and others. In 1812, there were 24,920 enslaved Africans. And in 1833, the last full year before the 1834 Emancipation Proclamation, there were 18,794 slaves. But what the British gave compensation on was 22,973. 69% of whom were field slaves, 13% non-field slaves, 13% children under the age of 6 years, and 5% aged and infirm. Now the lands which I described to you, at today's value, is over 2 billion Eastern Caribbean dollars. If you took the prices which they were sold for and you converted them into today's dollars, is over 2 billion. And if you convert the 592,509 pounds paid as compensation to the slave owners, and you multiply it by a factor of 829, it becomes an aggregate value today of 491.18 million pounds, or roughly $2 billion. Why 829? Go and read University College of London, Professor Draper's website dealing with this matter. 800 and, at the time of slavery, the emancipation of slaves, to now, the factor which you have to multiply by Stuart is 829. Now, when the emancipation of slaves took place, free villages were established, own-account work. Some people don't want to go into agricultural labor for below subsistence wages, but they needed to get more labor. 1,000 came in the late 1940s, quote-unquote free Africans, over 2,000 Portuguese, and about 2,500 Indians. All told, those three categories between 1845 and 1881 is 5,775 persons were brought in as indentured laborers. So you have the Africans, who at the end of slavery was, as I said, 22,973. And then, of course, you had this other population mix coming. Well, that's the country which we have today. And one of the descendants of the indentured servants from Madeira is the Prime Minister. One of the descendants from the slaves is the Speaker of the House. Well, how we are today? which is the next subject. How have we moved from, well, let me just make this point about the population as we moved on. You know, the migration has played a very important role in our country. People coming to populate and going out. And the data, I have a lot of data on that. But in the latter period, we have for instance, in the most recent intercensual period, the population increase has been very marginal. There's 900 and something people in those 11 years, new. And what we have is, in terms of ethnicity, 71.2% mainly African descent, then mixed 23%, mainly African and mixed with other ethnicities, indigenous 3.3, Indian 1.1, Caucasian 0.8, Portuguese 0.7, and others 0.2%. The others would include particularly some of the more recent arrivals from the Middle East and Chinese and so on. So what we have today was set in place, Father Mike, in the first 100 years. No. We have taken a long time to deal with the question of the land, because the plantation system collapsed between late 70s and the 80s. Of course, there were remnants after that, but basically. And bananas with the subsidies in the marketplace was a good commodity for small farmers to produce with the subsidies. So that helped the distribution too, as I indicated. How have we arrived now? Because we discussed the land, we discussed people. We have to discuss how with that land and the people we move from a culturally plural society in which every ethnic, racial, cultural section had its own relatively distinct pattern of socio-cultural integration. And through the fever of history and the process of creolization, in which biology helped, that we arrived at a position today where, not just today, but 30, 40 years now, where it's no longer a situation of a white cultural, ethnic, racial section controlling the lands and the resources, and having its own distinct pattern of socio-cultural integration. The mixed group having their own distinct pattern of socio-cultural integration. And the enslaved Africans and the Kalinago and the Garifuna with their own pattern of socio-cultural integration. And that society was kept together by force. Religion, Father Mike, remember when the enslaved Africans came on a Sunday when church was holding, they didn't go into church, And they had to have their own forms of worship. So too, the Kalinago and the Garifuna, until day by day, bit by bit, sweet Jesus, that we saw some changes. To one now, where there's a social stratification based on class, with residuals with ethnicity, and with status, meaning social estimation of honor. And of course, a dimension to account for patriarchy in the society. And this society which we have now is not held together by force, but by our consent, our sharing a core of values. For instance, in an earlier period, when there was talk of revolutionary struggle, meaning the violent overthrow of the state, it has turned out that Grenada is, in the whole sweep of history in our Caribbean, modern Anglophone Caribbean, an aberration in the way in which the NGM came to power. And that what we have is a commitment by everybody, well, overwhelmingly, to parliamentary democracy, voting, with a government and an opposition. That's why, and a lot of people don't understand this, every time you walk out of the house, you lose votes. Because people are committed to this principle of you being there. That is what they put you in council for. The old people tell you that. Don't walk out. Of course, the state has a legitimate monopoly on coercive power. You have a judicial system, the police, there are laws made by a free parliament. Now, the state. The state is something peculiar. And I don't want to go through all the ramifications, all the historical overview of from pure Crown Colony government to modified Crown Colony government and so on, coming up to 1951, one man, one vote, and gradual devolution of authority to the locally elected, to internal self-government in 1969 and to independence in 1979. Important as that is, I want to take us to a discussion which doesn't often take place. The first thing to observe about the state in St. Vincent and the Grenadines is that it did not grow out of the internal contradictions of the society, as happened in Europe, for example. The state in St. Vincent and the Grenadines was an external imposition. It was an external imposition by colonialism from a country which was already mercantile capitalist, moving towards industrial capitalism. But it suited them at that time to impose a slave mode of production here. So the first thing about the state is to notice that it was an imposition. And it came as a force standing above society, not emerging from it as a consequence of struggles within that society, where one side would win and occupy some central authority. No, imposed from outside as a force hovering above. And in the early period, imposed by force. Of course, consent came later, with popular democracy. But there is still in the society, because of the manner in which the state came into being, that there is, because it's seen as an alien entity, not belonging to us, there is still a tendency among some to use and misuse the state across all classes. To use and misuse and the resources of the state. In fact, on some occasions you get the impression that the ordinary man and woman in the country is more committed to things Vinci, to the landscape and seascape of the country, rather than to the democratic state institutions. It is true that more and more they're giving a commitment to the democratic state institutions. And that's why it behooves everybody who is involved in leadership to not seek to weaken the democratic institutions of the state. Because by weakening them, you are reducing the possibilities of the state itself to act as a force for good, as the state, indeed, the democratic state, has acted as a force for good for the people of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. As the people over the Dry River, who took light and water for them, who put road, who put school, who distribute lands. It's the democratic state, who give them a clinic, who distribute housing lots, and more would be distributed on on Monday. So I think that's a very important consideration which we must bear in mind. Now, in the struggle in the modern period, I want to throw this out without debating it, because I have it, I describe the thesis in this book. The social democratic revolution, which was unleashed after the anti-colonial uprising of 1935, October 1935, that social democratic revolution is still ongoing. Many important tasks have been accomplished, and others are still a work in progress, and some to be accomplished still, as the extant conditions in the country and the global economy change. But you see a direct trajectory, philosophically and practically, for the social democratic revolution between Mackintosh, Joshua, Cato, and our government. The only government of any length of time which was not openly within the social democratic tradition was Sir James's government, who defined himself as being a centrist liberal and wanting to have a property owning democracy. Well, that was not accomplished wholly. This doesn't mean that there were not social democratic interventions, and particularly in the field of law. There were many social democratic interventions because of the work of the Attorney General. Important areas of social democratic reform. And that struggle still continues. The people have to ask whether social democracy has expired. I happen to think that it's given greater lease of life, or whether you want to turn back the clock on social democracy and the social democratic revolution. Now I want to say this. In looking at the evolution of the political economy, I want us to appreciate the nature of the principal modes of production. There was slavery, of course, there was primitive communalism prior to the establishment of slavery. There was, at the end of slavery, capitalism introduced slowly at first, but more fully later. And that is what we have. But there were subsidiary modes always. Small-scale trading, small farming, and the like, which may or may not have explicit links with the capitalist economy writ large. But within the mode of production, productive forces may alter, which have an effect on real life, including politics and the direction of the society. One important development of the productive forces in this country was bananas. Away from plantation agriculture, easy crop to reap, to grow, relatively speaking, to sugar and root. Every week you can cut the bananas. Is an organized system of trading. And the rise of banana, in my view, the rise of banana and the gradual constitutional devolution and the end of the plantation system undermined the politics of Ebenezer Joshua. Joshua's base was the agricultural working class and people at the port and sanitation and the like. He railed against the plantation system. Well, if that is breaking up through all the various reasons, and if bananas are growing and people are independent farmers now, and you would see the lease which those things gave the Cato St. Vincent Grenadines Labour Party. Bananas created the stability for a functioning democracy in this country, and given rise to a greater sense of responsibility by people, more and more they had a stake in the system. A number of persons on the left didn't understand the importance of bananas. I want to put that down as a marker for further discussion I have there. Now, if I go, the promise of independence was contained in the preamble to the Constitution of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And by and large, we have stayed faithful to those promises. But because the material base had to change, because we had to build a modern, competitive, many-sided post-colonial economy at once national, regional, and global, you had to address many cross-cutting issues. You had to address the education revolution. You had to address energy. You have to address airports, citizen security, because we have moved from a goods-based economy, I reiterate, to a service-based one. Where today, more than 80% of the economy is service-based. And more than 80% of the working population is in the service sector. Even though agriculture and fisheries is about $140 million, current prices. And it's growing in that sense, but as a proportion of the economy, it's declining. It's now about 7.5%. The economy has grown from about $800 million GDP in 2001 to $2.2 billion. An average per capita income has risen from $7,800 to $20,000 annually. And we can talk about the statistics. And a veritable socio-economic transformation is taking place before our eyes, including with what is happening in information technology. As we go forward, what are some of the critical matters we have to look at? Climate change and the existential and its existential and security consequences. Resource scarcity, especially freshwater, arable and usable land, energy and insufficiency of skilled manpower, and investment capital and generally limitations of small size. Societal aging, this is a big issue for now and the future. Over 9% of the population is now over 60 years of age, and it's growing. The largest single growth in the population between 2001 and 2012 took place in the over 65. It's over 30% increase in that age group. Special limitations and burdens for marginalized and dispossessed groups, vulnerable young girls and women, troubled boys and men, and persons with disabilities. Issues touching and concerning good governance, regional integration, and citizen security. The impending new machine age of advanced artificial intelligence and its socio-economic and political impacts. The exogenous threats of war, terrorism, and global conflicts. The question of powerful countries wanting to undermine our sovereignty and independence and territorial integrity. And the issue as to whether in the global international relations system that which is quite complicated, whether the multilateralism is going to give way to unilateralism. Finally, something on the participation rate of women. Women in the labor force. Women are in every area of employment. Women are advancing. In fact, in the state sector, they are in the majority. Though in private sector, men still remain, and in some occupations, women preponderate, and there are others in which men. The issues relating to women, which we have to look at, those on which there's a lot of focus, like sexual harassment at the workplace and violence against women, including sexual violence, on which the country is moving and the state instituting many measures to address these questions. But we have to look, 4.8% of the population work in domestic households, and they're not properly protected. We have to protect them. And a big issue which we have to come to terms with in the future, how do we treat unpaid work in the homes? Of course, men also do unpaid work in the homes, but more women. By the way, the data show that of the unpaid labor, 56% of it is done by women and 44% by men. I was surprised by the number for men. I don't know how that one is calculated. But that's an issue which we also will have to grapple with increasingly. I would say after 40 years of the reclamation of independence, immense progress has been made in all material particulars. And there's still challenges, still work to be done. But it's not a time for pessimism, for hard and smart work, and for us to cut out our petty divisions. Thank you.